This is a real privilege to have Dean Cheng in here. Dean, I've known him for a couple of years now, and he is really all things China, all things cyber, but what most people don't know about him, he's really all things military. The insights that he has are really interesting. I keep talking to him about writing a book on these other sorts of issues. But speaking of books, he has a new book coming out, and it's Cyber Dragon, and I have already ordered it, I must tell you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Dean is he's one of the most quoted, cited person on China. He did go to Princeton, I think, right? Yeah. And has also done some things up at MIT. But what I asked him to talk about is his perceptions and his insights as to China and their view of cyber and cyberspace. And he will give you, I think, a different perspective than what you might have walked in here about. And I've asked him to also give us a little bit of idea of how the Chinese organize themselves for this issue. And I'm really, really looking forward to your presentation, Dean. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, General Dunlap, for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon. Usually there's a little more of a response from a large military crowd. I'm actually a little surprised by that. My name's Dean Cheng. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. My comments today focuses on China's interest in the information domain. Notice I didn't use the phrase cyber, because that's not really how the Chinese think about these sorts of issues. The idea is instead on establishing what they would term information dominance. And information dominance is an effort that begins in peacetime, and in fact, it's an aspect that really blurs the line between wartime and peacetime, between peace and conflict. They involve operations both below the threshold of kinetic warfare, as well as combine and coordinate with operations in time of kinetic conflict. One of the key things that I'd like to start with, though, is the context within which the Chinese look at these sorts of issues. It begins with the idea that calculations of national power and security reflect the socioeconomic conditions of the time. And therefore, as those socioeconomic conditions evolve, the kind of force, the kind of capabilities you need will also evolve. From the Chinese perspective, we now live in the information age. And what that means is that the currency of power, what really matters, is different than it was during the industrial age. You measured a nation's power during the industrial age by the sheer amount of steel you produced, gigawatts of power, et cetera. For the Chinese today, from their perspective, in the information age, it is much more about the ability to gather, transmit, analyze, and exploit information more accurately, more rapidly than your adversaries and your counterparts. For the Chinese, another part of the context is what they term comprehensive national power. This is how do nations rack and stack against each other. And some of the components of comprehensive national power include, not surprisingly, military power. If you can't defend yourself, you cannot be a major or strong power. But the lesson from the Soviet Union was that excessive reliance on military power alone leads to catastrophe. The Soviet Union, to borrow an analogy, how many folks here are fans of Game of Thrones? Okay. The Soviet Union was a little bit like Tyrion carrying the mountain sword, right? A little person and a sword multiple times bigger, kind of falls over. So the Chinese have learned from the experience of the Soviets to say that is not how you want to go down. Another piece, therefore, is economic power. What are the sinews of strength? But again, if you look at Japan, Japan was the #2 GDP, major economic power of the 1980s, and then it basically ran into a brick wall. So what are some of the other aspects here? Political unity. If you're not unified, you cannot become a strong power. And there, This is one of the reasons why Taiwan is an issue, Tibet is an issue, Xinjiang is an issue. Separatism is incompatible with great power status. Diplomatic respect, do other people even care what you think? China being a member of the UN Permanent Five is a key part to this. Science and technology. You don't want to simply make t-shirts and washing machines for other people. You want to move up that value chain. You want to be the one who is producing and even programming the microprocessors of the future. And then there's even cultural security. Do other people care what you're like? Do they want to be like you? One of the examples I sometimes give is the Transformer movies. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, Transformers, alien robots, they come to Earth, they just live among us, they've disguised themselves. What do they disguise themselves as? Trucks, aircraft, cars. But what's interesting here is to consider what kinds of cars and tanks. They disguise themselves as Camaros. They disguise themselves as M1s. They disguise themselves as F-22s. What that means is that if you are an 8-year-old saving up your money, whether it is in Bolivia, Botswana, Bahrain, to go and see a Transformers movie, you are implicitly being fed the message that if aliens came to Earth, they would disguise themselves as the most badass out there. And that is equated with the United States. They are not disguising themselves as J-20s. They're not disguising themselves as Armatas. They are not disguising themselves even as Leopard 2s. So that is an implicit message that is being steadily fed out there. So from the Chinese perspective, that kind of information, that kind of context, is something that they want to address. And so for the Chinese, they see the ability to gain information dominance as central to regime survival at the strategic level, at the operational level, as well as at the tactical level. And so at the strategic level, a key function here is the use of information, on the one hand, to preserve the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party within the context of China, as well as to deny the legitimacy of the US in the international realm. And so we see the Chinese at the strategic level engaging in what they term political warfare, which, by the way, is a responsibility of an entire quarter of the People's Liberation Army, what used to be called the General Political Department, now the Political Work Department, engaging in what they term the three warfares. The three warfares includes legal warfare, which I'm sure is of interest to quite a few of the folks in this room, public opinion warfare, and psychological warfare. It is, those three warfares are targeted at the Chinese population in order to build up the legitimacy of the CCP. It is aimed at the leadership, military and civilian, and populations of potential Chinese adversaries, including the United States. And it is aimed at the leadership and populations of third parties, because you're trying to influence how they view the United States and the PRC. In the context of something like strategic anti-access area denial, A2AD, the ability of the US to intervene in the Western Pacific, these three elements of political warfare should be thought of as the hardest form of soft power. It is the weaponization of information. Because if you can use information and how it is interpreted and how it is presented to deny the US access to the Western Pacific, that is every bit as effective as sinking a US aircraft carrier. In fact, in some ways it's more helpful, because you don't have 5,000 casualties. You haven't killed Americans and potentially created a rally around the flag effect as you did at Pearl Harbor. And so what do we see in the Western Pacific? We see the Chinese using various tools, weaponized tourism, weaponized agricultural imports to influence countries like the Philippines and South Korea. South Korea is, we have been pushing South Korea to deploy THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, a missile defense system, to help defend South Korea against North Korea. And China has argued that the THAAD is a threat to China. So what have they been doing to counter that? All of a sudden, if you are a South Korean pop star, you're finding your concerts are canceled in China. Lotte Markets, which owns the physical land on which THAAD is supposed to be deployed, has found that many of its projects in China are now being questioned, were canceled, were subject to additional inspection. And China has canceled thousands and thousands of tourist groups going to China, which of course affects hoteliers, restaurateurs, taxi drivers, and the message isn't subtle. It's, you're deploying THAAD, we see this as a threat, we don't want to come to your country and tour. If you don't like that, write your legislators, tell them to oppose THAAD. Not very subtle. But there's also legal aspects here, and one of the things that we see, for example, in the South China Sea is the use of the Chinese Coast Guard to emphasize, rather than the Navy, to emphasize their territorial claims out to the so-called 9-dash line. The use of the Coast Guard is particularly interesting, one, because it is, of course, less escalatory. The Chinese basically say, we're not militarizing the situation, at least in this case. We are deploying Coast Guard cutters, they're white hulls, they may be 10,000 tons, the size of a World War II cruiser, but they fly the Chinese Coast Guard flag. But there's an interesting political message as well. You don't use F-16s and Bradleys to patrol the south side of Chicago. You use the police. Why? Because it's a law enforcement, it's domestic security. So the message the Chinese are sending by deploying Coast Guard cutters is, these islands are ours. We're not going to deploy the Navy because they're already ours. This is a matter of law enforcement in our territory. It's an interesting message that they are sending that we may or may not be picking up on, but it is definitely being received in Hanoi and Manila and Kuala Lumpur. And then, of course, you have psychological warfare. And again, not to focus on the Chinese Coast Guard, but when you have a 10,000-ton cutter, which the Chinese do, and you are confronting a 400-ton cutter, there's an intimidation factor there, just plain and simple. Another one is video, and you can find this on YouTube, where Chinese ships literally ran down Vietnamese vessels during the HY-981 incident in the upper parts of the South China Sea a couple of years ago. I'm not sure who videotaped that, but it is not an accident that you see literally Vietnamese fishing vessels being run over at sea. That's at the very strategic level. Much of this is, as I said, not necessarily military, but make no mistake, the People's Liberation Army is also specifically thinking about the role of information, because that is its job, to exploit information should things ever go to the point of more kinetic operations. Now, a couple of contextual aspects about the PLA. First and foremost is that the PLA is a party army. Unlike the folks here, their first and foremost responsibility is not to the Constitution of China, they do have one. It is to keep the CCP in power. That is an explicit, formal charge. That is their mission. And it is important to note that for the PLA, all of its officers, above the rank of second lieutenant, are members of the party. So sometimes you hear about sort of this separation, civil-military divide in the PLA, that you have a rogue military. And I would suggest that there is very little actual evidence of that. Yes, you have factions, but you have factions of military and civilians in Faction A, military and civilian in Faction B, military and civilian in Faction C. And the other aspect here is that this is not your father's PLA. This is not a military that continues to focus on having more bodies, so that at the end of the day, you will run out of bullets before they run out of troops. This is a military that has paid very close attention to other people's wars, primarily those of the United States, in part because we fought so many, and because, to their mind, we have done a very good job. And so that is who they have modeled themselves after. So having examined, having focused, having studied the United States, what have they concluded? Well, one of the things they have concluded, beginning in the 1990s, is that the PLA needed to shift from focusing on quantity to focusing on quality, focusing on high technology. The other, and that was Jiang Zemin and his so-called two modernizations. His successor, Hu Jintao, sharpened the focus by giving the PLA the so-called new historic missions. What are the new historic missions? One, keep the CCP in power. As I said earlier, it's a party army. Second, preserve the conditions for economic development of China. That means, above all, preventing Taiwan from going independent. Third, preserving and defending Chinese interests in key domains, primarily the maritime, outer space, and information space domains. And then finally, promoting world peace through participation in international peacekeeping operations. And that sounds like a lot of pablum, but note that in order to do so, you have to learn certain basic things, like how do you sustain forces abroad, something China has never had to worry about. And what kinds of capabilities, everything from logistics support to information support, do you need to do to sustain forces thousands of miles from home? Again, for the US military, this is something we've been doing since at least World War II, if not before. For China, this is something brand new. Now, that was through the first Gulf War. In the wake of subsequent conflicts in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the Chinese views of future warfare further evolved. Shifting from high technology, they realized not all high technology is created equal. Similarly, having developed a focus on joint operations beginning in the 1990s, they concluded that joint is more than just having three services participating in a conflict. The PLA as ground forces, the PLA Navy, and the PLA Air Force. So by the early 2000s, what you saw was a shift in the PLA's assessment of future conflict, from local wars under high-tech conditions to local wars under informationized conditions. And the characteristics of such conflicts would be, one, that future wars would still be joint, but they would be joint in terms of the domains. That you would see simultaneous operations in the air, on land, at sea, in outer space, and above all in the information domain. And as a result, not all high technology is created equal, but the most important are those that have to do with information. Communications, computing, space, again, telecommunications, etc. Future conflicts then would require much more closely unified or integrated forces that could share and create a common situational picture, and that in turn meant the free flow of information among all the participating forces. And that meant going beyond just weapons and sensors. It means that you need to think about how information plays a role in command and control, how information plays a role in logistics, how information and what kinds of information you need to support those operations. And what kinds of people are you going to recruit? How do you train for future conflicts? All of these aspects, it is the informationization of warfare. So within this context then, the PLA has greatly emphasized, beginning in around 2002, the concept of information dominance for the military, meaning the ability to exploit battlefield information at times and places of their own choosing and denying an opponent that same capacity, as that applies to information collection, information management, and analysis. This is one of the reasons why psychological warfare is an issue, because all that information comes together at a human decision-maker level. Influence the decision-maker, and that is as much a means towards achieving information dominance as being able to blind a satellite or crash a network. Information dominance does therefore focus on degrading an adversary's command and control capabilities. And so for the PLA, the concept of information warfare goes to certain key capabilities and methods. And here we are looking at, first off, integrated network and electronic warfare. The Chinese were among the first to recognize and conclude that the stovepipe that we have between cyber operations and electronic warfare, network operations, electronic warfare, is in fact a misguided one. And so they have pushed to merge those two concepts together. Psychological warfare at the operational level. How many times does your email have to fail or be contaminated? How many orders for force movements have to go wrong so that your spare parts C-17 is landing in England rather than South Korea before you conclude that we're going to have to go to hard copy? And have you trained for that? Are you used to thinking about that? The U.S. Naval Academy, only in the last couple of years, has finally reinstituted celestial navigation, going out there with a sextant and shooting the sun. Well, why would you need to do that? I mean, you've got GPS. until GPS fails. But here's the interesting problem. You can shoot the sun and figure out roughly where you are with a sextant, but you can't do timing with a sextant. And you'd be amazed at how many parts of our military depends on the timing aspect of GPS to get those signals right, like frequency hopping radios, like IFF. So those are aspects, from a psychological perspective, if you lost your GPS, how discombobulated would you be? How retarded, meaning slowed down, that's not a mental assessment, but how retarded would your decision-making cycle become if you had to try and start doing things that, sure, you learned how to do land navigation or celestial navigation, et cetera, but you practice it once every 6 months. Increasingly, the PLA's writings beginning around 2009, 2010 have narrowed their focus further. So that I would suggest that the PLA's conclusion is that not all networks and not all electronic systems are equal, but that in particular, those involved with command and control and those involved with intelligence. And this goes to a fundamentally different way of thinking about things, which is to focus on shaping the framework, the context, the perspective. If I can influence the commander, whether it's the information that they're getting from their intelligence group, or the ability to get orders out through the command and control network, that arguably that is at least as powerful as being able to jam the last, set of frequencies between the pilot and the weapon. And so this is one of the aspects here that we are seeing them spending more and more time writing about and talking about. Then we have information operations. This is at the very tactical level. And here what is interesting is that, again, PLA writings about information operations do not simply talk about cyber. And in fact, they specifically go beyond cyber. So one of the interesting things, for example, is what they term integrated network firepower operations. If information warfare at the operational level sees the merging of computer network operations and electronic warfare. At the tactical level, the idea, again, is it's about the information. So sometimes you want to crash the network by introducing viruses. Sometimes you want to crash the network by perhaps jamming and frequencies. And sometimes there's no substitute for a Chinese version of a JDAM on your tactical operations center, when you absolutely positively want to be sure that it's going to go away. And the Chinese write very specifically about how it's not just about bits and bytes. The focus is, how do I stop the information flow? How do I disrupt it? How do I degrade it? How do I deny it? And so, conversely, the Chinese also write extensively about defensive information operations. Everything from networks that are set up in reserve that would be activated in time of conflict, to the essentialness of cover, concealment, and deception for everything from your command posts to your satellite networks. Do you deploy a full constellation in peacetime, or do you deploy enough to get you some of the information you need, expecting to reinforce it in time of crisis, which, by the way, will highly disrupt your adversary's ability to target if all of a sudden they went from 3 satellites to 14. Cyber operations, I don't want to give the impression that Chinese aren't talking about cyber, needless to say they are, but cyber operations exist as a subset, that they are an aspect of network operations. And interestingly, they are not seen as a standalone element. This goes to a question I think that was raised in the last panel. Could we imagine just a cyber war? And I think that the Chinese answer to that would be, one, in some ways we're already there. We are already in conflict with the United States and the West. We are in conflict because you have a system that challenges the legitimacy of the CCP. You have a system that seeks to constrain China's efforts to develop its comprehensive national power. It's not kinetic. We're not at war. We trade with each other. But in that context, we the Chinese, and you, the Americans, are clashing globally in terms of shaping public opinion, shaping perceptions, shaping international law, shaping rules and norms. And so there, yes, we are already in conflict in the cyber realm. But if it came to actual kinetic blows, then in that case, wars occur because you have a political objective. You want to prevent Taiwan from successfully declaring independence. You want to invade Japan, which, by the way, is not one of the Chinese priorities. How do you do that? Cyber alone is not going to be able to do that. You cannot convince Taiwan, if it is intent upon declaring independence, that simply because you turned off the power, that therefore, well, I guess we were wrong. I guess we'll happily submit and become part of China again. So in that regard, if it comes to that, then you have the need to be able to support your cyber operations with other information operations, and then kinetic operations. Interestingly, the Chinese do write about information deterrence, which is just, they don't talk about deterring others from doing things in cyber, any more than they talk about deterring adversary actions in space. Instead, deterrence, whether it is information, space, nuclear, is in the service of some larger strategic goal. And by the way, the Chinese term for deterrence is very interesting because it's a really bad translation for us to use that term. The Chinese words, wei se, which is translated as deterrence, includes coercion. For us, if you have read your Bernard Brody, if you've read your Thomas Schelling, we think of deterrence only as dissuasion. The United States will deter the Soviet Union from trying to take Berlin. The Chinese term for deterrence includes coercion, and so it is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, I will deter the Americans into walking away from Taiwan. Sounds like that's really bad English. And it's like, no, it's an accurate translation because both sides have chosen to translate the term wei se into deterrence. But an equally good translation would be to coerce. And so information deterrence in the Chinese context includes information coercion, along with nuclear coercion and conventional coercion. So within the context then of information, cyber, and deterrence, you have the issues of information security. And again, the Chinese, they actually publish a lot of stuff, and then we don't translate it. And then we say, you're not very open. And they sort of look at you and they say, we've written all this. Do you expect us to translate it for you? And sometimes you hear Americans say, yes. They sort of look at you like, wow. Information security from the Chinese perspective, interestingly, has 4 pieces. Hardware security, the physical security of routers and servers. And again, when you think of it as integrated information firepower attacks, that means everything from locking the doors to having SAMs and counter special operations forces around key information nodes. Software security, what is running on that hardware? Data security, notice the distinction. So you have the software that's running on it, which in China is often still Windows XP and maybe in fact a pirated copy of Windows XP, and then the data that's running over that network. And then finally what they term management security, and this goes back again to the human factor. Have you trained everyone not to insert a thumb drive that you found on the metro into your computer? There's some really ugly stories from our side about that. Does everybody regularly update the antivirus software? Do they go through all the training? Are they certified, et cetera? All of these are considerations as part of information security. Now notice, let me emphasize here, this is their doctrine. This is what they say they want to be able to do. Practice, what's the old line? That in theory there's, practice and reality are, practice and theory are the same, but in reality, practice and theory are different. So we have a China that on the one hand talks a lot about defensive measures and information security, and look at all the things you're supposed to do, and then you run a huge amount of pirated software. And one of the things that I think it is safe to say is that a pirated copy of XP is probably not getting a regular security update. So there's an interesting question about how many networks in China may still, in fact, have zero-day exploits that were closed everywhere else around the world a year, 2 years, 3 years ago. Now, the flip side to that is we keep hearing some interesting rumors that the Chinese, in fact, are running their own operating systems as shell. And so Windows and other things are really shells on top of a more homegrown operating system. That would be one way to keep things secure. But yeah, you can infect the outer shell, but you're not actually affecting the main guts of the computer. John Dunlap asked me to talk a little bit about how all this stuff is organized in China. And what is interesting about this is that beginning at the end of 2015, the PLA went through a massive reorganization. And that reorganization touches on most aspects of information for the PLA. Broadly speaking, there are three chunks to this. The first is the reorganization of the Central Military Commission. The People's Liberation Army is not run like our military. Okay? The services have a secondary role, which is pretty stunning, I'm sure, right there. The Central Military Commission, for the longest time, ran the entire PLA, was dominated by the ground forces. But service assignments really were a half-bureaucratic step below being a member of the CMC. So the heads of the services, the PLA Air Force, the PLA Navy, the 2nd Artillery, actually only got seats on the Central Military Commission in 2004. Of course, China was established in 1949, so for a long time, the Air Force, Navy, and 2nd Artillery actually had no formal voice at all. With this transition, what we saw was a shift from the 4 general departments that had previously existed. The 4 general departments would be the General Staff Department, Warfighting, War Planning, Military Intelligence, General Political Department, which is both political orthodoxy, political work, political training, but also the Chinese version of JAGS and NCIS, military journalists. If they had a chaplains corps, that would have fallen under GPD because the GPD is responsible for personnel morale and actually oversaw a lot of personnel management who would get promoted, et cetera. The General Logistics Department being bullets, blankets, General Armaments Department, weapons development, including the nuclear facilities, space systems were actually pretty much all controlled by GAD, and we think a bunch of the cyber aspects. Those 4 departments were reorganized into 15 departments, offices, and commissions. Even the Chinese have stopped claiming that this is to increase efficiency. It's almost certainly partly a function of internal bureaucratic support building for Xi Jinping. But I would note two entities that gained their own general departments now. One, mobilization. When was the last time we seriously thought about mobilizing the country and planning for it and exercising it and creating the bureaucratic structure behind it? And that applies to information technology because among the pieces of Chinese mobilization is S&T mobilization, mobilizing people, equipment, and facilities that are of central importance in the S&T realm, specifically information technology and space and computing, so that in time of conflict, people can be called up, equipment can be drafted, facilities can be transferred and used. And the other part is training. Training is now a general department within the PLA. So that was one piece. Second, the creation of several new services. As I said earlier, the ground forces were sort of implicitly in charge of a lot of things. But 3 services were created at the end of 2015. One was the PLA Ground Forces. It now has its own headquarters. That's actually a political and bureaucratic loss because you no longer assume when you meet someone that unless they're in a Air Force, Navy, or 2nd Artillery uniform, they are ground forces. Now they actually have their own patches and things. So the implicit aspect here is that there will be things that will no longer be automatically granted to the ground forces. Second, the elevation of 2nd Artillery to a service. Before that, it was a super branch. Why does this matter? It matters because for the third reform, which is the creation of war zones, you can't become head of a war zone and previously a military region unless you are of sufficient bureaucratic stature, your service was. And the PLA 2nd Artillery was not a formal service. And third, most relevant here, the creation of something called the PLA Strategic Support Force, which would be better termed the PLA Information Warfare Force. The Chinese combined their space forces, their electronic warfare forces, and their network warfare forces into a single service. In no small part because they have been emphasizing for almost 20 years that the future of conflict will be decided by who can gain information dominance, and now we have a service whose job is to do that. When you create a service, some of the things you do is you look for synergies, and you look for weaknesses, and you try to overcome them. The third aspect was the shift from 7 military regions, which were really largely peacetime entities, and even the PLA recognized that in time of war, those entities would go away, to 5 war zones, which are supposed to be permanent warfighting commands. And one of the most interesting aspects relevant to the discussion here is the military regions were, again, largely service stovepiped. Ground forces implicitly in charge. Sometimes you had an air or Navy guy as a deputy commander, one. The creation of the war zones stands up a permanent joint headquarters for each of the war zones. And we should expect to see the elevation of non-ground force commanders to head one or more of the war zones after this fall's party Congress. That will mean, again, a significant shift in culture, a significant shift in perspective, but above all, the emphasis on the free flow of information at the top levels on a day-to-day peacetime basis. It is not acceptable for you to stovepipe information within your service. Not anymore. So, interestingly, the 5 war zones, 4 of them are geographic, north, south, east, west, and there's a central war zone. And we're not really sure what that central war zone is supposed to be in charge of. Some folks have theorized that it's really for domestic purposes, and that's very important, is the ability of the PLA, again, to keep the CCP in power. If necessary, move forces to shore up. But I would suggest another possibility is a functional command, sort of like our STRATCOM, in which case you could, in theory, have the PLA rocket forces or the PLA strategic support force being put in charge of the central war zone. Because now, yes, it doesn't physically touch, but it has global responsibilities for space, for the information domain. And within that context, to think about it in that way also gives you a certain bureaucratic out. If you are the PLA-SSF and you can never become a war zone command, you're going to top out at some point on a promotion scale. You want to give people the interest in going into a particular service because they presumably want to have a shot at being promoted all the way to 4 stars. So let me conclude with a couple of hopefully key takeaways. One, that the Chinese concept of cyber operations is ultimately embedded in a much larger set of doctrine, which is focused on information, not simply cyber, information as it is analyzed, as well as collected, as well as transmitted. That the human factor and the physical factors in the Chinese assessment are as important as the bits and bytes. And finally, that the core objective for the PLA, but the CCP writ large, is to be able to better employ information in all aspects, not only of warfare, very important, but international conflict and competition. That the concept of information dominance is, again, not just simply dominating a network for a moment, but also influencing the broader, how you think about the information, how you look at it. And that this is, at the strategic level, as much a function of what the Chinese system at writ large is doing as their military is focused on at the operational and tactical levels. Thank you very much.
Dean has very kindly agreed to take some questions. Sir, in the back.
Thank you very much. How able and ready are the Chinese to disrupt our national infrastructure in order to take us out of the global stage?
In order to what?
Take us off the global stage, to remove us from global power.
Totally unprepared. That's a very serious answer. The idea that somehow China's views of both itself and the rest of the world is very different from, say, the Soviet Union. the Soviets were our evil twin. For those of you who are Star Trek fans, they were the universe where Spock had a beard, okay? So they mirrored us in many ways. They were a global military power. They had a messianic ideology. Everyone should follow a Soviet communist pathway, whether you were Botswanan, Burundian, or Bostonian. It may have taken a little more root in Boston. They didn't trade with other people. They didn't have to, and more importantly, they didn't want to. So that's a very different view of where they stood in the world than China does. First off, China is a regional military power. It has very, very minor presence elsewhere. It is not interested at this point in exporting ideology. Mao is dead. The Chinese are ruled by a Chinese Communist Party that is communist in one primary sense, Leninist vanguard party. There is a single locus of authority in China, of political power, and that's the CCP. But it is not trying to make Mali or Mexico or Malaysia Chinese communist. It is interested in exporting T-shirts and washing machines, not dialectics. But it is a global trading power. So what is it that the Chinese want? They want to dominate Asia above all else, which, considering it has 5,000 years of history where it dominated Asia, it's not an accident Xi Jinping describes this as the Chinese revival, the return of China to center stage. Very different from the imperial German model. You go to 1800, you look at any map, you ask people, so what do you think of the Germans? And they would say, who are these people? Because Germany didn't exist until the wars of unification had brought together all of the various city-states in Prussia and elsewhere. China has been there the whole time. The other piece to this is, from the Chinese perspective, balance of power. Europe had balance of power. Napoleon, the Kaiser, Hitler rises up, and all the other major powers of Europe combine to take them down. Asia, thousands of years of history, no balance of power. There's no history of the Japanese and the Vietnamese aligning against the Tang Dynasty, or the Koreans and the Khmers facing down the Han Dynasty. You had China, which was the regional hegemon. All of its neighbors knew their place, which was as a tributary state. So what is China interested in? Resources from Africa, resources from Ukraine, resources from South America. But politically replacing the United States, frankly, for much of the less developed world, the Chinese are the preferred twin, and we're the evil twin. We're the ones who show up in a country and say, you treat your minorities really badly. You need to think more about democratization and religious freedom and ethnic equality. The Chinese are like, I'm interested in buying your bauxite. Bauxite is currently selling at $4 a ton. I'm willing to pay you $4.10 a ton if you'll sign me a 20-year deal. And you use that money however you want. You want to build sports stadiums for your population? Go ahead. By the way, I can offer you a really deep discount on Chinese labor to help build that. You want to use it to buy guns to shoot your ethnic minorities? Have at it, because I don't care, as long as you deliver me that bauxite. So if you're a less developed country with a moderately authoritarian bent, you're looking at this and it's like, I like these guys. You guys are a pain in my tuchus. So in that regard, it's not clear at all that the Chinese really want to displace us, other than in certain key aspects. They want to extend their sovereignty to parts of international common spaces, the South China Sea, international oceans, it's the cyber world, probably outer space. And they want to change a lot of the rules because, and this is an absolutely central part, especially for this audience, China does not believe in rule of law, that all of us are equal before justice, which is blind. China believes in rule through law. The law exists because I know where I want to go. I want to be able to claim the South China Sea. I'm going to throw a whole lot of legal arguments against the wall, and when it works, it works. So would you like a historic rights argument? Got one. You want to use a baseline argument? Got one of those too. You want I just have more guns than you do? I got that. It's not about rule of law. And the Chinese have been upfront about this. They said at the 2010 ASEAN Regional Forum, there are big countries and there are small countries. Small countries need to know where they stand, i.e., not on the same podium as the big countries.
While people are formulating their question, let me ask you a question from John. John Carlin's presentation.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the argument about the deterrence of the indictments of certain Chinese PLA people? What's your assessment of that?
Yes. The question was, one, did I see John Carlin's presentation at the very top of today's events? Yes. And what did I think of the argument that the prosecution of 5 members of Unit 61398 may have had a deterrent effect? In my personal opinion, I want to emphasize personal opinion, I am not sure that I would agree with that assessment. What I would say is several things. One, those 5 members of Unit 61398, and frankly, most of the rest of Unit 61398, plus all the various other units that exist, weren't really ever going to go abroad and be subjected to any kind of prosecution in the first place. By the way, for those who are curious about what is a Unit 61398, the Chinese military operates something called military unit cover designators, 5-digit numbers that are assigned in blocks to different units. So Unit 61 would be General Staff Department, 3rd Department, and then 398 was it. So basically, when you read Chinese military newspapers and things, they don't say the 14th Regiment of the 3rd Motor Rifle Division did X. They would say Unit 44219 did X. If you really are bored, you can actually assemble a database on these things. I have the great fortune of having friends who are easily bored. And they have assembled databases of this, so you can in fact trace some of these units back. But Unit 61398, one of the key points to recognize is that it's not the only one. There are a host of other 6-1 units whose job was to do cyber. So point one is, did it deter? Not really. I think what has happened is, one, it has forced the Chinese to up their game. Because one of the things the Chinese openly wrote about is, well, you really can't do attribution. Right? You can accuse us of being responsible for X, but how do you really prove it? And apparently we said, well, here's our sources and methods. That was brilliant. On how we figured out that it was Unit 61398 that did X. The other piece to this is that at the end of the day, we need to recognize that the Chinese, again, think of deterrence and coercion differently. Yes, you figured out that I am able to do this. Does that affect your concept of information security? Does it affect your decision-making knowing that I have units running through your networks? In fact, that I don't respect you very much because I'm willing to trail my coat openly. It's a little bit like, sort of naval operations, where I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm going to openly be in your face. Is that if I stop doing that, that might be deterring, it might not be. It is interesting to note that at least some information security specialists I've talked to have suggested that the Chinese have not cut back on their cyber operations. What has happened is they've gone more quiet, which is to say, before I openly typed in Chinese, hi, I'm a Chinese PLA officer who is in your networks. Now, I don't do that. Now I don't, I check in at 7 o'clock local time. And maybe I come in on the weekends. Because you told me, by the way, that how did you determine that it was a PLAU? Well, it was coming out of this particular ISP at these hours. Thank you very much. So I think that, is China deterred by this? China reacted to this. I think that's a very different conclusion.
Professor Curtis?
Analysis. I'm curious as to your opinions regarding a comparison of your analysis of Chinese behavior, goals, and so forth. I recall reading a book, The 100-Year Marathon. The 100-Year Marathon.
Oh, the 100-Year Marathon, yes.
Yes, sir. Could you Could you give me some comparison of how you rate that with your recent analysis of Chinese behavior? The arguments put forth in the 100-Year Marathon.
The 100-Year Marathon was written by Mike Pillsbury. I would say that Dr. Pillsbury and I are both analysts of China. And one of the things that is very clear if you talk to analysts of China is that we're at least as bad as economists. Which is to say, that if you put two economists in a room, you'll get around 5 or 6 different opinions. And I think the same that I disagree with him in other assessments. And I have no doubt that if he were up here, he would probably say the same thing. So.
There's an article today in the Daily Caller that says that McMaster may seek to showdown in the South China Sea. What would you think the reaction would be of China of such a showdown?
Wow, the dangers of social media right here. I mean, so, hi, I'm looking at this on my tablet, and it's like, okay, Truth in Advertising, 1, I haven't seen this article. 2, therefore, I really have no idea what he means by showdown in the South China Sea. If the U.S. were to land the 82nd Airborne by airdrop on some of these islands, blow them up, et cetera, I think we'd be at war, frankly. I think that if the U.S. were to try to impose a blockade, and I use that word very deliberately because I have read just enough legal stuff to be very dangerous and know that a blockade is an act of war, I think the Chinese would view that as an act of war. If, however, the United States were to increase its freedom of navigation operations, and let me note here that, for example, in the last 3 years, the U.S. has conducted innocent passage activities around Chinese claims. Innocent passage basically is where we sail a ship, guns fore and aft, radars off, choppers tied down in the hangar, we basically cut across claimed territorial waters. And we sort of say, we're not really sure we're going to accept your claim. So we're not going to let you know in advance. This is different from freedom of navigation operations. It's a subset. And actually, before I continue, this is very dangerous. I am not a lawyer. I am not trained as a lawyer. I sure as heck am not trained as a maritime law expert. And the Coast Guard is here.
But he plays one on TV, so.
So yes. So anything that I say that is wrong, I obviously defer to the U.S. Coast Guard, that is fairly represented here. But, yeah. Oh, and the Navy is here as well. Oh, geez. Sorry about that. Yes. So, well, there was all that stuff about law enforcement. But the point here being that we have refrained from doing full-blown FON-ops, political messaging, whatever. And I think that we have taught the Chinese that they can push in terms of their claims and their sovereignty. I think that the first time we do it, the second time we do it, the third time we do it, there will be a reaction. Whether it is unsafe ship handling, like we saw with the USS Cowpens, whether it is dangerous buzzing of U.S. aircraft, which the Chinese have done repeatedly, whether it is interfering with our ships, as they did with the USNS Impeccable and the USNS Victorious, I think that they will basically be pushing back to say, look, this is ours. We've been very forthright in making this claim. We ignored the Permanent Court of Arbitration's findings, and that is our position. Now, what's your counter move to that? If we are persistent, if we are consistent, if we prevent the creation of an easement concept, I think eventually we get back to a higher level of tension than existed in, say, 2009, but less than will be occurring in the immediate aftermath. That's my opinion. Totally unsupported and uninformed by any legal training. And I, as I said, I defer to the Navy and Coast Guard legal experts who are here.
Ryan?
So some of us are not very versed in this realm, and I would ask, can you explain why that's important to the U.S., whether or not the island exists, what it means? Because I've kind of looked over, and a few of us are slightly confused.
Okay. first off, I ask you, therefore, to think about a map of Southeast Asia, okay? You have this giant swath of water that basically you have Hainan Island, which if you were to put a map of China over the United States, Hainan would be sort of like Florida, okay? And then you have all the way reaching down to the Philippines and Malaysia, which forms an arc several hundred miles further south, far beyond 200 nautical miles, which is the extent of an exclusive economic zone. Why does this body of water matter? Money. $5.3 trillion worth of trade transits through these waters. This is the carotid artery of global trade. You cut that, you start doing bad things to global economies, including China's. Okay? The Japanese are net oil importers. The Koreans are net oil importers. The Taiwanese are net oil importers. All of these countries, maybe not South Korea, import food. Where does all that come from? It transits through the South China Sea. And conversely, exports go through the South China Sea. So why does this matter to the United States? One, because we happen to like having a global economy that functions relatively smoothly. Two, a matter of principle, which is the only warship in the U.S. Navy today that has seen action is the USS Constitution. And it fought the War of 1812 and the previous conflicts involving France, undeclared war, in part over freedom of the seas. That is as much a core interest of the United States, a fundamental principle, as for the Chinese, territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that's part of the reason for the clash. Why does it matter to China, this water? Four broad reasons. One, resources, not oil. Why do I say not oil? Because nobody actually knows if there's oil down there. Everyone sort of thinks there might be oil. Geologists will tell you that estimates are as high as 2 billion barrels, and then when they drill the test drills, they keep coming up dry. But in theory, there could be oil. But the resources that do matter is food. These are some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. And China is increasing its consumption of protein because it's getting wealthier. Second is political legitimacy. The CCP's legitimacy is in part rooted on the idea of we defend the motherland. We defend our territorial sovereignty, and we have said this is ours. And third, from a plain old military context, strategic depth. Hainan is Chinese for Kola Peninsula. So for those of you who remember the Cold War, the Kola Peninsula was some of the most militarized real estate on Earth. On Hainan Island is China's newest spaceport, an SSBN facility, a carrier facility, at least one, possibly several submarine pens blasted into cliff sides, multiple air bases, military air bases. The EP-3 incident of 2001, the EP-3 that crash landed on a military air base on Hainan Island. China's economic center of gravity is on the coast. There is no strategic depth in the sense of before, when it was inland, you had lots of land on which you could base SAMs. Now, you can pop up with, whether it's Tomahawk shooters or F-35s, and you have much less warning time. So China wants to push us as far away as possible.
Real super quick,
Okay.
assuming I can read it. Kyle Leuenberg, Duke Law, what is the perspective of China regarding the disruption of the global trade paradigms? Do they continue to respect, or is there wariness on their part? You a little bit answered that before, but you want to just flesh it out?
So just very quickly, China has benefited from the global trade system, but China also recognizes that at this point the global trade system is not one that it created. So it would very much like to reshape parts of it in its favor, and other parts it will likely leave alone. China's approach towards free trade, particularly having joined the World Trade Organization, which requires respecting intellectual property rights, is a matter of record. Whether it respects them or not is a matter of record. But the U.S., by pulling out of things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a regional free trade agreement, does leave the terrain, in a sense, up to the Chinese to try and define. So At this point, they are very, very curious and worried about what Mr. Trump is going to do, because if he has been willing to touch the third rail of U.S.-China politics, which is the one China principle, in his first 3 weeks in office, they can only imagine what 3 years might lead to. Let me note here that's neither an endorsement nor a condemnation. It's merely a statement of fact.
I can honestly say I've never heard Dean speak when I didn't come away with the thought, wow, I didn't know that. And you really have expanded our intellectual database, and thank you so much, Dean. We are now on break for 14 minutes, and enjoy it.